The nanny had never been touched by anyone until the millionaire boss closed the bedroom door. The winter wind cut through the small bus station, numbing Grace Miller's hands. She dragged along her worn-out suitcase, its cracked wheels squeaking against the cold floor. At just 27, Grace felt as though the weight of the entire world had been placed on her shoulders. The southern town where she had spent her whole life suddenly seemed too small, too poor to hold her any longer. Only a few months ago, Grace had been working as a nurse's aide at the town's tiny hospital. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and allowed her to care for her mother. Then the hospital shut down due to lack of funding, leaving dozens unemployed, including her. At the same time, her mother was admitted to a larger city hospital after serious complications from diabetes. Medical bills stacked like mountains, each envelope cutting deeper into Grace's growing fear. She knew she had to do something. She needed another path. The live-in tutor and caregiver position she stumbled upon online felt like a lifeline. A wealthy tech entrepreneur in San Francisco was searching for someone to both teach and look after his 6-year-old daughter. The salary was more than Grace had ever dared to imagine, enough to cover her mother's medication and even send extra home. The only condition, she had to move into his household. Before she left, her mother had clutched her hand tightly. The hand was frail, weak, but her eyes brimmed with worry. "Sweetheart, be careful. Rich people don't live like we do. Don't trust too easily, especially not men." Grace tried to smile, though anxiety churned inside her. "I know, Mom, but this is my only chance." The 30-hour bus ride carried Grace away from peaceful fields to a city of restless lights. San Francisco greeted her with cold air and hurried crowds. Towering glass buildings rose like steel giants, devouring the gray sky. Horns blared, footsteps echoed, the sea breeze whistled, an overwhelming symphony of strangeness. "Oh God, this place is enormous," Grace whispered, almost unaware she'd spoken aloud. She dragged her battered suitcase out of the terminal. The squeak of its wheels echoed against the oil-stained pavement. No one spared her a glance. People rushed past with coffee cups in hand, phones pressed to their ears. Cable cars clanged down their tracks, mingling with blaring horns in a discordant symphony. Grace felt as though she'd stumbled into a film playing too fast. Faces blurred past her, just shadows in motion, while she remained small and misplaced. Back home, 5 minutes down the street, and everyone knew my name. Here. Her eyes swept over the sea of strangers. No one even cares that I exist. The address in her notebook led her to one of the city's most prestigious streets. When she finally looked up, her breath caught. Before her stood a gleaming glass tower, so tall it seemed to pierce the gray sky. The automatic doors slid open as a uniformed doorman greeted her with a polite, rehearsed smile. "Good evening, miss. Do you need help with your luggage?" His voice was deep, courteous. Grace startled slightly, shaking her head. "Oh, no, thank you. I can manage." But as her gaze dropped to her worn, scuffed shoes and then lifted to the polished marble beyond the doors, her chest tightened. Everything inside glittered. Crystal chandeliers like fallen stars, fresh flowers arranged with care, leather chairs gleaming under the lights. Her battered suitcase looked like an intruder in this palace of perfection. Do I really belong here? The thought pulsed in her mind. Yet Grace drew a long breath and tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. She knew that behind those doors, despite her fear, lay the only path toward a different life. The glass doors closed softly behind her as Grace drew in a deep breath. The vast lobby unfolded like another world. white marble streaked with gray veins, abstract paintings aligned with precision, and a faint fragrance of orchids hung in the air. A petite older woman approached. Her hair was silver, pinned neatly in a bun, her black and white uniform crisp. Her gaze was sharp, yet steady. "You must be Grace Miller?" Her voice was soft, but unmistakably clear. "Yes, I am," Grace answered, slightly startled at being addressed so directly. "Welcome. I'm Mrs. Chen, the Sullivans' housekeeper. Please follow me." The elevator glided upward without a sound. Grace stood silently, watching the numbers climb, her heart quickening with each floor. When the doors finally slid open, a carpeted hallway stretched ahead, leading to an enormous walnut door. Mrs. Chen swiped a keycard, and the door opened to reveal a world that stole Grace's breath. The living room stretched wide and tall. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city glittering with lights. A cream sofa sat perfectly arranged, as if pulled from the pages of a design magazine. Everything was spotless, gleaming, beautiful, yet eerily still. "This apartment is stunning," Grace whispered before she could stop herself. Mrs. Chen's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Mr. Sullivan designed it himself, but you'll soon notice, it's far too quiet, especially for a child." Grace looked up. The words carried an unspoken truth. Behind the elegance lay a hollow silence. The apartment was magnificent, yet devoid of warmth. And in that instant, Grace realized her job here might not only be about teaching. Mrs. Chen led Grace down a long hallway, the carpet so thick that their footsteps made no sound. At the end stood another heavy walnut door. She knocked softly 3 times. "Mr. Sullivan, Miss Miller has arrived." A deep, decisive male voice responded from within. "Come in." Grace drew a long breath. Mrs. Chen opened the door, gestured for her to step inside, then quietly withdrew. The room was a vast library and office combined. Afternoon light poured through the glass wall, casting across dark wood shelves and a broad desk cluttered with papers and blueprints. The air carried the rich scent of coffee mingled with polished oak, warm yet commanding. A man stood with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear, voice cold and firm. "I made it clear. The deadline is the end of the month. If they can't deliver, we'll find another partner." He ended the call without a goodbye and slowly turned. Grace froze. The man before her was tall, broad-shouldered in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he had just run his hand through it. But it was his steel-gray eyes, sharp and luminous, that stole her breath. "Miss Miller," he said, his tone lower now, less cutting but still full of authority. "Please have a seat." Grace sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, hyper-aware of the gulf between his elegant world and her own. Andrew opened a folder. "I've reviewed your resume. You were a nurse's aide?" "Yes, for nearly 5 years." "And your experience with young children?" Grace swallowed, steadying her voice. "I've cared for many young patients. And my younger brother lost his voice for almost a year after our father passed away. I learned that sometimes children don't need quick solutions. They need time, patience, and the sense that they're safe." Andrew's eyes softened slightly, as if she had touched a hidden memory. He closed the folder. "My daughter Sophie still hasn't recovered from losing her mother. It's been 2 years. Since then, she's gone through 3 tutors." He paused, fixing his gaze on Grace. "I need someone who won't leave when things get hard." Grace clasped her hands tightly in her lap, inhaling deeply. I won't leave, Mr. Sullivan. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but enough to ease the tension. The salary is $6,000 a month, including room and board. Weekends off unless there's an emergency. Do you agree? Grace's heart hammered. The amount was more than she had ever earned. I agree. Andrew rose and extended his hand. Welcome to the Sullivan family, Miss Miller. His hand was warm, firm, lingering a moment longer than necessary. A faint current shot through Grace's arm, and she had to steady herself to keep from pulling away. As she left the office, she could still feel his gaze following her, as if he were trying to read a book whose ending had yet to be revealed. Later that afternoon, after Grace had settled into her own room, Mrs. Chen guided her to a white-painted door at the end of the hallway. This is Sophie's room, she said softly, tapping gently. She doesn't usually take to strangers right away. Be gentle. The door opened a crack, revealing a bedroom straight from a fairy tale. Pale pink walls, shelves stuffed with picture books, and a princess bed draped with white lace. The soft glow of a lamp made the room feel both magical and strangely sad. In the corner sat a little girl, curled up tightly, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit. Her brown curls tumbled forward, half hiding her face. Her wide gray-blue eyes were heavy, but she didn't look up as someone entered. Sweetheart, Mrs. Chen coaxed, this is Miss Grace. She'll be helping you learn and play. Sophie stayed silent, hugging the rabbit closer. Grace took a steady breath, then lowered herself onto the floor, keeping a respectful distance. Her voice was as gentle as a breeze. Hello, Sophie. I'm so happy to meet you. No reply. Only a small shiver ran through the girl's shoulders, another wall raised against the world. In that moment, Grace remembered Andrew's words. 3 tutors had already left. She understood this silence wasn't indifference. It was armor for a wounded heart. She smiled softly, her eyes filled with patience. That's all right, Sophie. You don't have to say anything. I'll be here waiting for you whenever you're ready. She stayed a few minutes longer in quiet companionship, then offered a final gentle goodbye before slipping out. That night, around 2 a.m, Grace woke with a start. A muffled sob echoed down the long hallway. At first she thought it was a dream, but listening closely, she knew. Those were the cries of a child. Small, relentless, slicing through the dark. Grace slipped on a cardigan, her bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. The sound led her to the princess bedroom. The door was ajar, a faint nightlight spilling out. Inside, Sophie writhed in Andrew's arms. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with tears. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed, pajamas rumpled, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Sophie, you have to sleep, sweetheart. School is tomorrow. Please, I have work too. I don't want to go to school, the little girl screamed, pushing him away. I want Mommy. She's coming back, isn't she? Andrew closed his eyes, as if every word cut him to pieces. His voice broke, trembling. Baby, we've talked about this. Mommy can't come back. Liar, you sent her away. She's coming back. Sophie bolted from the bed, running into the wardrobe, burying herself in the darkness behind dangling dresses. Grace stood at the doorway, her heart twisting. The scene ripped her back to her own childhood, 7 years old, when her grandmother, the only one who truly cared for her, died. She had hidden in her own closet too, believing if she stayed long enough, the pain might disappear. She knocked softly on the frame. Andrew looked up, his eyes bloodshot, lost. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you, he rasped. Grace stepped forward, steadying herself. "It's all right. May I try?" The silence was heavy. At last, Andrew gave a small, almost desperate nod. Grace lowered herself to the floor, sitting opposite the wardrobe. Her voice was warm, measured. "Sophie, you know, when I was your age, I lost someone very important too. My grandmother. I thought it was my fault, that maybe if I had been better, she would have stayed." A hiccup inside. The dresses shifted slightly. "But the truth is," Grace continued gently, her eyes soft, "sometimes the people we love have to go, not because of us. And yes, it hurts so much we want to hide. But that doesn't mean they vanish forever. They stay right here." She placed her hand on her chest. "In our hearts." A small face peeked out, eyes wet. Sophie stepped out shakily, hugging the worn rabbit so tightly it might burst. "But I can't see Mommy." Grace held out her hand, her voice a whisper. "You don't have to see with your eyes. You can feel her here. Try. Do you feel her?" Sophie shut her eyes, pressing her little palm to her chest. After a long moment, she nodded, whispering, "I feel her. But it still hurts." Grace gathered the child into her arms. "It hurts because you love her so much, and you don't have to carry that pain alone." Andrew remained at the door, unmoving, his expression transformed, no longer lost, something deeper now. Gratitude, recognition, a fragile spark of hope. "You'll stay with me?" Sophie murmured. "I'll stay," Grace promised softly, "for as long as you need." And in that moment, the room itself seemed to breathe again. Grace knew she wasn't just lulling a child to sleep. She was opening a door to a new beginning, for all three of them. Morning light streamed through the apartment's vast windows, painting the kitchen in a soft, golden hue. The faint aroma of pancakes drifted through the air, mingling with the rich scent of fresh coffee. Grace, still a little drowsy, descended the stairs. Chen stood by the stove, skillfully flipping golden rounds on the griddle. "Good morning, Miss Miller," Mrs. Chen greeted with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Grace replied warmly. She was about to offer help when small footsteps echoed on the staircase. Sophie appeared, clutching her familiar stuffed rabbit. Her brown hair was tousled, her eyes shadowed with the remnants of a long night. Yet this time, she paused at the last step, hesitating as she looked at Grace. "Good morning, Miss Grace," Sophie whispered, soft as a breeze but unmistakably clear. Grace froze, her heart blooming with sudden warmth. Quickly, she smiled, kneeling down to meet the child's gaze. "Good morning, Sophie. Would you like to have pancakes with me?" Sophie nodded lightly, then slowly made her way to the table. For the first time since Grace's arrival, the little girl had spoken willingly. They sat together. Sophie ate quietly. Yet every so often her eyes flicked toward Grace, as if to make sure she was still there. Grace returned each glance with a smile, never pressing, only offering her steady presence. The morning carried none of the tension or tears Mrs. Chen had once described. Just then, Andrew appeared. He wore a gray suit, his tie perfectly in place, but his steps faltered as he took in the sight before him. Sophie calmly eating, Grace by her side, morning light wrapping around them both. "Good morning, Daddy," Sophie said. Andrew froze. He couldn't remember the last time his daughter had greeted him so simply. Surprise and emotion flashed in his eyes. "Good morning, Princess," he answered, his deep voice softened. For a brief moment, his gaze met Grace's. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Something had shifted, And it was Grace who had sparked the change. That afternoon, after picking Sophie up from school, Grace sat with her in the living room, helping with math homework. Each number made Sophie frown, but with one more patient explanation, her eyes lit up. "Can you show me again? I think I get it now." "Of course," Grace replied with a nod. "We'll go slowly. No rush." When they finished, Sophie suddenly tugged Grace's hand, leading her out to the back garden. The space unfolded in lush green, a stone path winding through bright flower beds, rose bushes blooming under the sunset glow. "Will you play hide and seek with me?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with hope. Grace laughed. "If you want to, then I'm in." For the first time since they met, Sophie laughed out loud. The sound was pure, ringing like wind chimes across the garden. Grace hid behind the roses, letting Sophie find her easily. They collapsed together on the grass, breathless and laughing. In that moment, Grace saw it clearly. Behind the sorrow in those gray-blue eyes, there was still a radiant soul waiting to be freed. "Daddy!" Sophie suddenly cried, her gaze darting toward the veranda. Grace turned. Andrew stood there, his tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, as if he had just shaken off the weight of a long day. He froze, watching his daughter laugh in the garden, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Hello, Princess," he said, stepping down the stairs. "Look, Daddy, Miss Grace and I are playing hide and seek." Andrew watched, then slowly bent to scoop Sophie into his arms. She squealed with delight, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Her laughter rang out, so pure it tugged at Grace's heart, joy mixed with sorrow for all the lost time. "Can you play with us, Daddy?" Sophie pleaded. Andrew glanced at Grace. Their eyes met, hesitation passing between them before he nodded. "Of course." And just like that, the garden filled with laughter. Sophie darted around, Andrew chasing her with exaggerated clumsiness, while Grace stood nearby, laughing and cheering them on. As the sun dipped lower, Sophie ran back to Grace, clutching her arm, her eyes shining. "Miss Grace, will you stay with us forever?" The innocent question left Grace breathless. Her heart lurched. She glanced at Andrew. He was already looking at her, his gaze deep, unreadable, offering no quick answer. That night, the back garden lay bathed in silver moonlight. The scent of jasmine drifted gently, leaves whispering in the cool breeze. Grace stepped out onto the veranda for some air after a long day. She hadn't expected Andrew to already be there, hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze lifted toward the rare scattering of stars above the city. "Can't sleep?" He spoke first, his voice low. Grace startled slightly, then offered a small smile. "I'm used to staying up late. Back home, I'd sit outside and look at the moon. It reminded me that no matter where you are, the sky is the same." Andrew turned toward her, studying her for a moment. "Thank you, Grace." "For what?" "For giving Sophie her laughter back, today. I haven't seen her that happy since her mother passed." Grace lowered her head, hearing the honesty in his voice. "Sophie just needs someone patient. Honestly, she has such a strong heart." Silence settled between them, broken only by the rustle of flowers in the wind. Andrew sighed. "I've tried, but sometimes I feel I've failed her. I buried myself in work, in running from the pain, and left Sophie alone with her loss." Grace turned to him. In the moonlight, his face revealed the weariness hidden beneath his hard exterior. "You haven't failed, Andrew," she said softly. "You just lost your way for a while. But Sophie never stopped needing you. And tonight, you were there, playing with her, That's what matters. He was quiet, his eyes darkening with emotion. Then, in a lower voice, he murmured, "It's strange, hearing you say my name." Grace froze, her heartbeat quickening. "I usually call you Mr. Sullivan." "Call me Andrew," he interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. "At least when it's just us." A pause lingered. Grace felt the distance between them thinning like a fragile veil. Moonlight traced the strong human lines of a man carrying wounds. "Andrew." She tried the name, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly, a rare curve of warmth breaking through his guarded mask. Then he stepped closer, leaving only half a breath between them. In that instant, Grace knew, if not for Sophie, they might have crossed that invisible line. Yet she also knew the emotions they shared were no illusion. They were real and growing stronger. One Thursday evening, the apartment was wrapped in an unusual silence. Sophie had been invited to a friend's house for a sleepover before the next day's school trip. No little footsteps echoed down the hall. No giggles drifted from the princess room. Grace had planned to spend the quiet night reading in her room. But as she brewed a cup of tea, a sound carried from the living room. The slow, weighted notes of a piano, like the telling of an unfinished story. She stepped softly toward it. Andrew sat at the glossy black grand piano, sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, long fingers gliding across the keys. His face tilted downward, the lamplight carving sharp, sorrowful lines across his features. "That's beautiful," Grace breathed, thinking she'd spoken only to herself. The music stopped. Andrew looked up, gray-blue eyes touched with surprise. "It was Elena's favorite," he said, his voice low, threaded with memory. "My wife." Grace stayed quiet, unable to find words. Instead, she stepped closer, as if to share in the silence. "Do you play?" Andrew asked, shifting the subject. "A little, but it's been a long time." He moved aside, leaving space. "Try." Grace hesitated, then sat beside him. Her fingers struck a few clumsy, uneven notes off rhythm. Both of them laughed, the sound breaking unexpectedly through the heaviness. "I think I've lost whatever skill I had." Grace chuckled, covering her mouth. "No." Andrew shook his head, eyes lighting with rare relief. "I can't remember the last time I laughed like this." Silence followed again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was warm, softened by shared laughter. Andrew tilted his head, studying her. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. "Grace, there's something I've wanted to tell you." She turned, meeting that intense gaze. Her heartbeat stumbled. His fingers brushed her cheek, warm and gentle, so tender she closed her eyes without thinking. The space between them dissolved, and then his lips met hers. The kiss was not rushed, not fiery, but slow and tender, carrying everything unspoken between them. When they parted, both were breathless, their eyes still locked. Grace began. But Andrew shook his head, a faint smile at his lips. "Don't say anything. We'll figure it out. Together." In that moment, Grace knew with certainty the line had been crossed, and there would be no going back. After that evening, the apartment felt subtly changed. Neither Grace nor Andrew spoke further of the kiss beneath the piano light, yet the silence between them was no longer heavy. Instead, it was a fragile thread, pulling them closer with every glance, every unspoken gesture. In the days that followed, Sophie grew more cheerful. She shared school stories at dinner, proudly showed Grace drawings of sunflowers, and even Andrew seemed to rediscover the rhythm of fatherhood. For Grace, each simple moment softened her heart, yet also stirred a quiet fear. Could this peace really last? On Monday morning, while Grace was arranging Sophie's books in the living room, Mrs. Chen approached, her voice gentle but tinged with unease. "Miss Miller, there will be a guest today. Mr. Sullivan's sister, Mrs. Clara. I think you should be prepared. She can be quite exacting." Grace's pulse quickened. Andrew's sister, a woman who surely carried great weight in this family. An hour later, the sharp click of heels echoed through the foyer. Clara Sullivan entered exactly as Grace had imagined. Slender, dressed in a tailored designer dress, her perfume expensive and cool. She crossed the living room with a polite smile, though her eyes, sharp as blades, inspected every detail. "You must be Grace Miller?" Clara's voice was even, edged with steel. "Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you," Grace answered, steadying her tone. Clara didn't sit right away. She circled the room, gaze sweeping like an appraisal of something unfamiliar. Finally, she stopped before Grace. "I just want to be sure you understand your place. Andrew is a good man, but far too trusting. And our family. We don't welcome those who come here simply for an easier life." Heat rose to Grace's face. "I'm here for Sophie. She needs me." "Perhaps," Clara replied with a dismissive shrug, her smile cold and empty. "But I've seen the way my brother looks at you. He has loved once before and lost everything. I won't allow history to repeat itself, especially with someone not of our class." The word class fell like a hammer, striking straight at the insecurities Grace kept buried. Memories of worn shoes, unpaid bills, her mother's frail figure, all rushed back, cracking the fragile confidence she had begun to build. Clara turned away, leaving behind only the faint trace of perfume and a silence that pressed heavily against Grace's chest. Grace stood frozen, her hands clenched, fighting to keep her voice steady. But inside, a chilling thought began to take root. Perhaps her presence here had been a mistake from the very beginning. That night, Grace hardly slept. Clara's words echoed like needles in her mind. "Not of our class. You don't belong here. It's better if you leave." She sat by the window, watching San Francisco's lights flicker outside. The city glittered, but to Grace it blurred into a painting she was never meant to fit into. In her ears, her mother's warning replayed. "Don't trust too easily, especially not men." Her heart was torn in two. On one side was Sophie, the little girl who had just begun to open up, just begun to laugh again. On the other was Andrew. The way he looked at her still haunted Grace, as if they had touched something undeniable. Yet Clara had been right about one thing. Grace had never truly belonged to this world of wealth and glass towers. Before dawn, Grace rose. Her small room still held traces of warmth. A few books, the old scarf her mother had knitted. Everything felt both familiar and temporary. She opened her suitcase, hands trembling as she folded each piece of clothing. On the desk, she left a small card addressed to Sophie. "My dear Sophie, you are a wonderful and strong girl. I believe you'll keep shining, even if I'm not here. Always remember, I love you. Grace." As she zipped the suitcase shut, footsteps moved softly behind her. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, silent, watching. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice low without reproach. Grace nodded, forcing her tone to stay steady. "I think this is what's best for everyone." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, sorrow flickering in her gaze, but she didn't stop her. She simply sighed and stepped away, leaving Grace alone with her suitcase and her heavy choice. Grace knew. This time she wasn't leaving because she wanted to. She was leaving because she believed it was the only way to protect the people she loved, even if it meant tearing her own heart apart. Grace pulled her suitcase into the hallway just as dawn broke. The long, carpeted corridor was eerily silent, as if the entire apartment were holding its breath with each of her steps. When the elevator doors slid open, she placed her suitcase inside. But before she could step forward, a familiar voice rang out behind her, urgent, breathless. "Grace!" She turned. Andrew stood there, his tie loose, chest rising and falling, his gray-blue eyes burning in the pale morning light. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rough, a mix of anger and fear. Grace lowered her gaze, gripping the suitcase handle tightly. "I think this is what's best. I don't belong here. I don't want to hurt you or Sophie." Andrew strode closer, his hand firm on the suitcase handle, stopping it from rolling into the elevator. His voice was low but unyielding. "Hurt us?" "No, Grace. Leaving is what would hurt us. I don't care about class or what anyone else says. All I know is that since you walked into our lives, everything has changed." Grace trembled. "Andrew, I'm scared. I don't want to break your family apart any further." He shook his head, eyes fierce. "You're not breaking us. You're mending us, Grace. Sophie needs you, and so do I." Silence hung heavy, his words echoing down the corridor. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but a small sob interrupted. Sophie stood at the far end of the hall, clutching her rabbit, eyes glistening. "Miss Grace, you're leaving me?" Her little voice broke. "You promised you'd stay." Grace's heart shattered. She dropped to her knees, arms open. Sophie ran into her embrace, sobbing against her chest. "Please don't go," Sophie whispered, her tiny body trembling. Grace held her tight, tears streaming freely. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. I never wanted to leave you." Andrew lowered himself beside them, his hand resting gently on Grace's shoulder. She looked up, meeting his eyes full of pain, resolve, and something deeper than words. "Grace," he said softly, "don't you see? You're not just a tutor. You've become part of us. If you leave, we'll lose more than you realize." The three of them clung together, silence broken only by their unsteady breaths. Then Andrew, with a steadiness Grace had never seen, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple, elegant silver ring. His voice was low but unwavering. "Grace Miller, I don't want to ask you to stay only as a caretaker or a friend. I want you to stay as family, as my wife, as Sophie's mother. Will you marry me?" Grace's throat tightened. In her arms, Sophie lifted her tearful face, eyes shining with fragile hope. Andrew waited, his gaze trembling yet full of love. Grace's tears spilled freely, but this time they were tears of release. All the fear, the shame, Clara's words, they all dissolved. "Yes," she whispered, then cried harder, clutching Andrew's hand. "Yes, I will." Andrew exhaled, pulling them both into his embrace. Sophie wrapped her small arms around them, her voice muffled but radiant. "We're a real family now, aren't we?" "Yes," Andrew answered, his eyes locked on Grace. "From now on, we're a family." After the proposal in the hallway, everything seemed to settle. Grace's heart was still trembling, not yet keeping pace with what had just happened. But in Andrew's arms and in Sophie's hopeful eyes, she knew she had found what mattered most: a home. The next day, Clara arrived. The living room grew tense as she entered. Grace sat beside Sophie, while Andrew faced his sister, his voice steady. "I don't care what you think. This is my choice." Clara studied them for a long moment, then sighed. Andrew, I only feared you'd lose everything again. But seeing Sophie smile like that, perhaps I was wrong. If Grace can bring that joy back, I won't stand in the way. Grace's eyes brimmed with tears. Andrew's hand in hers confirmed that doors long closed were beginning to open. Weeks later, Andrew brought Grace and Sophie to her hometown. The old house, the small garden, and her mother, Mrs. Miller, sat on the porch with a faint but joyful smile. When she saw her daughter arrive with Andrew and Sophie, her eyes lit with happiness. My girl has finally found where she belongs. Grace hugged her mother, her frail but steady hands holding tight. Mama, this time I know I've chosen right. Andrew stepped forward, his voice sincere. I promise to take care of Grace and Sophie. We want to build a true family. Mrs. Miller nodded, tears falling but her smile unwavering. With Sophie's laughter echoing through the garden, Grace felt the peace she had been searching for. Back in San Francisco, things shifted. One evening, the family gathered at the dinner table. Sophie chattered about school, Andrew teased lightly, and Grace sat watching, her heart overflowing with quiet joy. The once cold home now rang with laughter and warmth. After dinner, they wandered into the garden. Sophie twirled among the flowers, her small dress fluttering. Andrew took Grace's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Thank you for staying, he whispered. Grace looked up, her eyes shining. Thank you for giving me a family. Beneath the stars, 3 once broken souls had found one another, and their story, instead of ending, had only just begun.